On June 21, 2021, 16-year-old Mikhail Garin was helping travelers explore the Ergaki National Park as a tour guide in the Cyan Mountains of Siberia. The area is a picturesque tourist resort with rocky mountains and high waterfalls. The summer is the only time of the year that the province is easily accessible for tourists to explore. Animals like the snow leopard, moose, wild boar, and wolves are some of the largest populations that inhabit this rough geography. But the most formidable of these predators is the infamous Russian grizzly bear. It is the largest bear species on the continent, at over 2.5 meters in length and standing more than 3 meters tall on its hind legs. Armed with a set of 42 teeth, including molars and razor-sharp front canines, it can tear through its victim's flesh and deliver crushing force to the bone in a single bite. Thousands of fatal bear attacks have been recorded in the last few decades, and most of them have resulted from humans venturing too close into bear territory. On that fateful day, early in the morning, young Mikhail was making preparations for visits and exploration trips around the park for the group of travelers that had hired him as a helper and tour guide. He realized he was short on some important supplies for the camp and decided to make a quick trip to a nearby village downhill. It was 7 in the morning, and the sun had barely started to shine through the dense fog and clouds. The path to the village went through a forest cover that remained frozen for most of the year. The young boy picked up his backpack and set afoot downhill to the village, hoping to make it back in time. The cold morning fog had silenced the crunch of the leaves that littered the forest floor. He had seldom been up so early and had just started his new job as a tour guide at the park. Mikhail walked among the tall forest trees, with only the occasional chirping bird that disturbed the dead silence. After just a few minutes of walking, he heard a muffled grunt in the distance that perked up his ears. He was aware of the danger of animal attacks in the area, but had never encountered one. The boy looked back, trying to pierce through the morning fog to see into the distance, but there was nothing there. He quickened his pace and walked straight ahead, and he dismissed anything he heard as the odd deer or elk that would sometimes graze the forest. He then heard the grunt again, this time much closer behind him. It was followed by the sound of footsteps approaching in the distance. The little boy glanced back, and what he saw froze him still in terror. A giant mass of brown fur peeked at him from among the woods. The feared grizzly bear stood less than 10 feet away from the frail young boy, with its eyes locked straight on him. Mikhail stood there, unsure of the next move to make. He had studied wildlife brochures about the area and knew that running was the greatest mistake he could make in that moment. There was no one to call out to for help. It was just the massive bear and the little boy, surrounded by miles of forest on every side. Mikhail's heartbeat raced, as every step back he took was matched by a step forward of the bear. In desperation, he looked up at the trees in hopes of climbing into safety, but the branches provided no support to pull himself up. The bear realized how vulnerable the boy was and lunged straight at him with all its might. Grizzly bears can stand on their 2 hind legs and like to swiftly kill their victims with a massive stomp on the neck to immobilize its prey before feasting on it. The bear leapt at Mikhail from the distance, pinning him beneath its legs. The little boy screamed in pain with the massive weight of the bear atop his fragile body. The predator growled at him and took aim for the neck, plunging its front canines deep into his flesh. Mikhail could offer no resistance and breathed his last in just a few short minutes. The animal dragged him deep into the woods and cut open his torso to devour his insides. Several hours had passed, and the tourists back at the camp were left wondering where the young boy had gone. Despite searching and calling out his name, Mikhail was nowhere to be found. The camp settlement was close to the opening of the forest, and they ventured into it trying to find him. Just a few minutes later, they discovered something that confirmed the brutal tragedy that had taken place. It was the half-eaten corpse of the young boy, identified by his shirt, lying beside the trees in the distance. Horrified at the gruesome nature of his death, they stumbled forward trying to assess what had actually happened. It was only a few moments later that they noticed the grizzly bear among the woods guarding its kill. The tourists now found themselves in the same predicament as the young boy, but didn't know what to do. In desperation, one of the tourists ran back to his camp, prompting the bear to chase after him. But the man was armed with a small pocket knife, which he used to take several jabs at the animal's neck as it leapt onto him. The small knife was no match for the sheer size of the bear and was only enough to momentarily throw it off. The animal walked away and sat down near Mikhail's half-eaten body, giving the tourists just enough time to escape and run back to their camp. The men went and alerted authorities at the Ergaki National Park, detailing the death of their tour guide and their harrowing ordeal they just went through. Several park rangers and sharpshooters spread into the forest in an attempt to locate and tranquilize the man-eating bear. The park was immediately closed, and everyone working was called back to safety. By the time the men made it to the site where they found Mikhail's body, they found the bear still lying beside him on the forest floor. The park rangers, assuming that the bear was dead from the knife wounds, approached the animal to carry it away. But as the rangers went close enough to reach, it got up and lunged at the men. Fortunately, the ranger was armed with a rifle, loaded and aimed at the bear, and fired several shots as it jumped at him. The bear was finally dead, with over 7 bullets to the head and chest. The tourists looked at the body of the young boy, which resembled a mauled carcass, and realized how lucky they were to have escaped the attack with just a few cuts and bruises. The attack was the result of a series of coincidences that ended in the brutal demise of the young boy. The prolonged freezing winters had forced the grizzly bears to descend and populate the forests closer to human settlements in search of food. That eventually led to crossing paths with humans more often, resulting in an erosion of fear and greater proclivity to see humans as prey. Climate change had also been depleting their natural diet and disturbing the natural food chain of their habitat. On that fateful day, the final nail in the coffin for Mikhail was his decision to take a shortcut to the village through the forest instead of the path circumventing the forest carved out by the park authorities. The news spread like wildfire and prompted action to retreat human settlements further away from bear territory in order to avoid another fatal attack. But 16-year-old Mikhail wasn't so lucky, and his half-eaten and almost unrecognizable body was scooped up and buried at a graveyard nearby. His family was left devastated at the loss of their son, who had gone out to earn a livelihood and support them at such a young age, but tragically instead met his untimely final affliction. Glacier National Park in western Montana is one of America's most popular national parks, with over 700 miles of hiking trails and almost 800 natural lakes. There are many activities and sites that attract millions. It is perfect for someone who wants to reconnect with nature and discover themselves in the solitude of pure wilderness. With 25 active glaciers, the landscape is an incredibly rare sight to behold, and truly something to see once in your lifetime, a place to visit before you die. Despite this, most people would not like this to be the place that they die, but for some, they were not given the choice. Sometimes, life takes a dangerous turn in unknown territory, as 2 women discovered in 1964. Our story today begins on August 12th in 1964, where young lovers Julie Helgeson and Roy Ducat were camping together on their first solo trip together. They worked together at the Glacier Park Lodge, where their romance had first begun, and now they were finally able to gain some solitude and privacy away from the prying eyes of their colleagues. They had made their way up to the viewpoint earlier in the day, hitching rides from drivers along the way, just to be able to see the beautiful view in front of them as the sun was setting. They set up their camp about a quarter-mile from a nearby chalet, which was booked up for the night, and settled in for an evening of romance and beauty, falling asleep in each other's arms. At around midnight, Julie was awoken by a sound outside of their tent, a rustling from the bushes that she immediately recognized. She shook Roy awake, urgently whispering that there was a bear outside. They were both very familiar with the bears in the area and knew that they were in great danger. At present, the animal was just walking around their camp, sniffing their gear in search of something to eat, but was seemingly unaware that the couple were huddled within the thin nylon material of the tent. Suddenly, the bear tore through their shelter and grabbed Roy's sleeping bag. It began to shake him violently and thrashed its head back and forth in an attempt to kill him. Roy could feel the force behind the animal's bite as he was thrown to the ground, trying to keep as still and quiet as possible so that the bear would leave him alone. The bear had other ideas. Once it had thrown him out of the tent, it jumped onto his back. Julie could only watch in horror and pray that she wouldn't be noticed. The bear began to bite into Roy's back and legs, hoping to break through the sleeping bag and get to his meal within. Roy couldn't help but scream from the pain, feeling the weight of the animal on top of him and the jaws sink deeper into his body. Suddenly, he remembered his training from the lodge. Play dead if you come into contact with a brown bear. He immediately went limp and stopped screaming, biting his tongue to stop himself. Thankfully, this method worked almost instantly, and the bear walked away from Roy, leading it straight for Julie instead. Seeing the bear pivot its direction towards her, she began screaming as she thought her lover had just been mauled to death in front of her. Alarmed by her noise, the bear charged her and grabbed her by the legs, clamping its jaws tightly around her ankles, and began dragging her into the forest and away from camp. Roy lay there playing dead throughout the entire event. When they were both out of sight, Roy pulled himself up and ran to get some equipment from the camp, hoping to be able to scare the bear away from Julie and save his love. In a panic, he attempted to find a flashlight to scare the bear, but he was quickly realizing how badly he was actually hurt and started feeling lightheaded due to blood loss. Knowing that Julie would not stand a chance if he passed out, he began to run up to the nearby chalet to beg someone for help. As he made his way to the chalet, he stumbled upon Don Gullett, who was sleeping in a tent near the chalet, undisturbed by the noise that Roy and Julie had been making. He quickly awoke him from his deep sleep and told him what had happened. As he was telling the story, the pair could see lights begin to turn on in the chalet as other residents were disturbed by the noises and screams of Julie in the distance. Don knew that the residents needed to be informed to get help, but by the time they would reach the chalet, it would be too late. He began shining a bright torch at the residents instead, signaling SOS in Morse code. One of the people in the chalet recognized the signal for help and shouted out towards them asking what was wrong. The men replied with a bone-chilling message: "Bear." The chalet burst into action. Joan Devereaux, a naturalist, immediately called for emergency assistance from authorities. Steve Pierre, a member of the local Native American tribe, assisted in locating the bear with a small group of other visitors. After gathering some volunteers and flashlights, Steve and his team set out towards the site of the attack. The message from Joan had reached the forest rangers, and they too began to set up an emergency rescue to save and retrieve Julie. A helicopter equipped with FLIR and night vision technology was deployed into the area within minutes after receiving the call and began to search the area for any signs of Julie or the bear. Meanwhile, Roy was begging people to come back into the forest with him to save Julie, but Joan advised against it and told people that they should stay put until the rangers arrived. While Roy continued to argue with the group, Steve and his team had found a blood trail that led into the forest and decided to follow it. They hoped to find Julie alive and well at the end of it. They began to shout her name in the hopes of a response, and, miraculously, they heard a very faint reply that led them straight to her. What they discovered next shocked them. She had somehow been stripped of most of her clothes, leaving her torn skin exposed to the elements. There were puncture marks all over her body from where the bear had grabbed and dragged her along. She was weak from blood loss, and the team instantly knew that there was little hope for her. Regardless, they held her hand in support and brought her back to the chalet. Miles away from a hospital and on the verge of death, they called in the chalet priest. With Roy at her side as the chalet priest read the Lord's Prayer, she finally succumbed to her injuries at 4:13 a.m. on August 13th. She was the first ever fatal bear attack to take place in Glacier National Park, but she would not be the last. 4 hours after Julie's attack and 8 miles away, there were 5 employees working at the McDonald Lodge who had closed up for the night and were settling down to sleep, ready for the rest of their shifts tomorrow morning. The employees included Paul Dunn, Michelle Coons, with brothers Ray and Ron Nelson also present. As they were relaxing at their campsite, they spotted a large brown bear walking nearby, who quickly raided the camp. The campers stayed silent and watched in fear, praying they wouldn't be discovered. When it sauntered off, the group decided to quickly move camps so that they wouldn't run into the animal again later. Despite moving to another camp, the bear returned several times that night, sniffing their camp and attempting to steal more food and grunting from the dark trees nearby. The group continued to lay silent inside their sleeping bags, knowing that a single noise or movement could mean certain death. Finally, the bear re-entered the camp for the final time and began sniffing around the campers as they lay in silence. Paul realized too late that his sleeping bag wasn't properly closed, and before he could even move, he felt the bear's nose poke inside. Smelling the man within, it suddenly grabbed the bag and began to shake him violently. He was able to slip out before any real damage was inflicted and managed to run straight into a nearby tree, almost certainly escaping a mauling in the process. Knowing that the bear had discovered them, he began to shout to his friends to run and no longer lay in silence, as it wouldn't save them anymore. They all jumped up, surprising the bear, and they began to run into the trees. Although stunned, the bear recovered almost instantly and began to sniff around the abandoned sleeping bags. From a nearby tree, overlooking the bear sniffing around their abandoned camp, the group realized they were missing someone. Michelle. Michelle had stayed in her sleeping bag, hoping that playing dead would still work. After all, that was how she was taught to react if she found herself in a bear attack. The bear quickly discovered her and bit into her arm. She shouted out to her friends for help, screaming that she had been caught by the animal and it had her arm, but they had no way to help her. She knew she was in a terrible situation and prayed that she would be able to survive. The group lost sight of her as the animal tugged her into the forest, but her screams could be heard for miles. Terrified, the group sought refuge in the trees until dawn and waited for the sunlight to finally show the fate of their friend. Strangely, they were unable to find any sign of her by morning and immediately abandoned camp and hiked back towards the lodge nearby. They came across the ranger station first and burst in, hurriedly explaining the situation, and stated that their friend was missing. The Rangers had already dealt with Julie's bear attack just hours previous, so they initially believed them to be reporting the same fatality. But they soon realized that the situation was much more urgent, as there were possibly 2 bear fatalities in the same night. They quickly gathered their equipment and headed towards their camp. During their search, they encountered a local fisherman who explained that he had seen a bear dragging a girl into the woods by the mountain, and they quickly changed their direction accordingly. As soon as they arrived at the place where the fisherman had reported seeing Michelle, the rangers discovered overwhelming evidence that she was tragically no longer alive. The path was covered in blood, skin, and tissue, leading directly to the corpse. It was a horrific sight to see. She had been brutally torn apart, and her body had been casually cast aside and scattered in the forest. Horrified by their discovery, they called for the rescue team, who retrieved the body and brought Michelle back to the lodge. After already dealing with another killing just hours before, the rangers quickly began to lay bait traps to lure the bear into the open to shoot it. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful at tracking down the man-eating bear. Despite this, one of the rangers came face to face with the bear the next day, and after some stalking, they were able to finally take the bear down. They autopsied the animal and found parts of Michelle within its stomach, finally ending the rampage. That night, Glacier National Park changed from no recorded bear fatalities in history to 2 in just one night. A heartbreaking and truly unlucky story for both of the women, who just wanted to enjoy a simple camping trip, but instead met their terrifying final affliction. The grizzly bear is a fierce predator and should be avoided at all costs. They have been responsible for over 180 deaths in recent years, although the majority of the time bear attacks are very rare. They will usually only attack when they are protecting food, their cubs, or territory, and would rather avoid humans altogether. However, there are some people who intentionally seek them out and enter their territory, like Timothy Treadwell, aka the Grizzly Man. Even at a young age, Timothy had always been particularly fond of animals, and even had a pet squirrel when he was a child. In his adolescence, he had his first encounter with a wild bear while studying them in Alaska, and that's when he realized his true life calling. He stated that he had lost his way at college, and he had fallen into alcoholism and drug use, nearly overdosing on heroin in the late 80s. This close call with death is what motivated him to initially search out bears and make them his lifelong passion. He studied the bears for 13 years and wrote a book from his findings called Among Grizzlies, Living with Wild Bears in Alaska. During this time, the bears became used to his presence, and he was able to touch them and play with their cubs. In his own words, he stated that he had a good relationship with bears based on mutual trust and respect. Following the release of his book, Timothy began to gain some recognition for his work in television and environmental circles. He traveled around the U.S. to educate local schools and appeared on many TV shows to explain his unique experiences with the animals. He even created his own charity with co-worker Jewel Polovec called Grizzly People, with a plan to continue protecting the grizzly bears in their habitat. Timothy was met with controversy throughout his life, mainly due to his interference with the animals. The National Park Service, in particular, were very unhappy and worried with his actions, as they believed that he was disrupting the animals' natural behavior, as well as putting himself at enormous risk. Timothy was also leading unauthorized tours with visitors to take them closer to the animals, something that was never allowed by the parks. He was thought to be reckless, as he refused to install any electric fences around his camps or carry bear spray, stating that bears would never hurt him due to their relationship together. Despite their fears, Timothy did not bring any further protection from the bears, and he would soon find out that his relationship with these bears could easily be broken. In October 2003, Timothy and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, visited Katmai National Park in Alaska. They were warned of the dangers of camping in the area at this time of year, as food was scarce and the bears were preparing for winter, eating anything they could to store for hibernation in the coming months. The aim of the trip was to see one of Timothy's favorite female brown bears and wanted to check that she was okay and ready for the winter. Amy was very reluctant to do this, as she was particularly scared of bears and just wanted to go home, but she stayed as she knew how important the bears were to her boyfriend. Throughout the trip, the pair tracked a few of the bears, but Timothy quickly realized that the majority of the bears that were familiar with him had gone into hibernation already, and there were a number of unfamiliar bears. Although he was slightly uncomfortable with the thought of being surrounded by bears that didn't know him, he still decided to stay and set up camp with Amy. On October 5th, the pair were setting up their video camera to get some more footage of the bears. The setup was nearly complete. The camera was on and recording audio, but the lens cap was still in place, providing no visuals as of yet. Soft rain sounds can be heard as Amy prepares the equipment from inside the tent. Suddenly, Amy calls out to Timothy asking him if he's still out there as she can't hear him. Then the screaming begins. Timothy was screaming to Annie to get out of the tent and to escape as he was torn apart by the large 28-year-old male bear. Amy opens the tent and begins screaming at Timothy to play dead to get the bear to leave him alone, which seemed to have worked for a time, as the pair can be heard discussing whether the bear was truly gone yet. In this time, Amy is thought to have approached Timothy to tend to his wounds, which were unknown at this point, but she had to retreat as the bear returned to attack Timothy once again. This is when Timothy begins to panic, as he realizes playing dead is no longer going to work. He begs Amy to hit the bear with something, and she grabs a frying pan to smack the bear in the head. The bear lets go of Timothy's head and instead bites into his thigh to drag him away from Amy. Covered in blood and knowing he has no chance of survival past this point, Timothy begins shouting to Amy, telling her to run away and save herself. Although he struggled, he knew enough about bears to know he was done for. Unlike other victims of bear attacks, he didn't go into shock during the attack and was fully aware the entire time he was eaten alive by the animal that he loved so much. The bear was silent, aside from sporadic growls and grunts. The only real sound that could be heard during this ordeal is the sound of Timothy desperately trying to escape. His screams of agony and the dull sound of his body being dragged across the dirt away from his camp. Unfortunately, Amy still didn't leave. She was frozen with fear and in shock from the horrifying scene. She was already terrified of bears and had just witnessed her worst nightmare. She wasn't familiar with the area, being brought to the park by Timothy, and had no idea how to get back to civilization. On the tape, you can hear her suddenly begin to scream. It was a scream similar to that of a wounded animal, as she realized what she had just witnessed as well as her situation. Unfortunately, her screams only brought the bear right back to her to finish the job, and Amy was also mauled to death by the same bear. The next morning, air taxi pilot Willie Fulton arrived at Kaflia Lake to transport the pair out of the area. He looked around and thought he could see Timothy shaking a tarp to get his attention, but when Willie called out, there was no response. He decided to hike up the path, but quickly turned around as he felt like something wasn't right. Once he reached his plane, he turned around and saw something that made his blood turn cold. Through the fog, a large, nasty-looking brown bear was staring at him just aside from the path that he had just followed. He quickly climbed back into his plane and set off, hoping to scare the bear off with the engine so that Timothy and Amy would be able to pass through without meeting the bear. He kept his eyes on the bear and could see him slowly eating something. Willie circled the campsite 15 to 20 times, each time trying to get a better look at the bear and what it was eating. That's when he realized that the bear was eating a human rib cage. Horrified, he called the park rangers and asked them to come and survey the area, as he believed something had happened to the bear. A group of rangers arrived and began to trek up to the campsite, with Willie guiding them. They spotted a couple of bears on their way up, but as the bears ignored them, they continued without an issue. Suddenly, one of the rangers shouted, "Bear," alerting the others to the animal about 20 feet away. They began shouting at the bear in an attempt to scare it off, but it soon became clear that it knew they were there, was not threatened, and was actively stalking them. They all began shooting at the bear, firing a total of 21 shots between the three rangers. They didn't stop shooting until the bear was shot dead. They continued to the campsite where they found Timothy and Amy's 2 tents collapsed and torn, with a large mud pile at the front of the entrance. The rangers moved some of the mud aside and found Amy's body with her fingers pushing through the dirt. She had been buried by the bear, ready for winter. When they moved the rest of the mud aside, she looked as though she was peacefully sleeping, except for the clear fact that she had been almost entirely eaten by the bear. They were horrified but determined to find Timothy, although the hopes of him being alive were fading fast. They combed the nearby area and found bits of him scattered all around the forest. His head was found attached to a piece of his spine, with a horrific grimace on his face, capturing the pain in which he died. His right arm and hand were also found lying nearby, his watch still attached. It was a gruesome scene to find. As the rangers were discovering the bodies, another smaller bear attempted to approach them. He was approximately 3 years old and was stalking the team from 30 feet away, making it clear that he would continue to approach and attempt to attack them. He was swiftly shot by the rangers, who didn't want to take any chances given the situation they were in. Once Timothy and Amy's bodies had been extracted from the park, the rangers sent the corpses of the large bear to be investigated. A necropsy was conducted, and it was found that the bear had human remains and clothing within its stomach, concluding that this was the bear that had killed and eaten the couple. The younger bear had already been cannibalized by other bears, so we will never know if it had anything to do with Timothy and Amy's deaths. Ultimately, it's important to remember to respect wild animals and give them the space that they deserve. Even if bonds are formed with the animals, you never know what might happen, or what else might be lingering in the forest, waiting for the chance to bring you to your horrifying final affliction. Mark Jordan and Jacqueline Perry were celebrating their 4th wedding anniversary. Being outdoor enthusiasts, they both decided to mark the occasion with 2 weeks camping in Canada's Lake Mississauga Provincial Park. The 100,000-hectare park offers an incredible outdoor experience. Popular activities include canoeing, backpacking, boating, fishing, and camping. There are over 100 different campsites, many of which are only accessible by boat. When you set up your tent in Lake Mississauga Park, you really are on your own. Although this can be a magical experience, it can also prove deadly. Visitors are attracted to the area for its outstanding beauty, the large, peaceful lakes with their glassy surfaces reflecting the woodland surrounds, the haunting call of the loon, and the nighttime howling of wolves, the majestic beauty of a moose standing knee-deep at the lake's edge, or the glimpse of a black bear through the thick brush. It was September 2005, 80 kilometers north of Chapleau, Ontario. Mark and Jacqueline pulled up into a car park in Lake Mississauga Provincial Park. Together, they lifted their double kayak off the roof of their car and lowered it into the river. They loaded it up and climbed in. Both of them were enjoying the tranquility of the wilderness. They barely saw a soul for the first few days of their trip. They moored up at remote campsites. Often, the only indication it was a campsite was the presence of a thunderbox. This was a 3-sided cubicle placed over a hole in the ground, which is used for a toilet. After pulling up at one campsite, the couple spent the remaining hours of sunlight organizing the tent, campfire, and dinner. They took a swim in the lake before settling down beside the blazing fire. The trip had been magical so far, a break that both of them had needed. The following morning, they awoke at the sun's first light. Stretching and yawning, Mark unzipped the tent and saw to the fire. He managed to reignite it from a few remaining embers. He collected some water from the lake to boil on the open flames whilst Jacqueline foraged for wood to keep the fire going. They had a long paddle ahead of them until the next campsite, so decided to have a proper breakfast and fill their flasks with plenty of tea. As Jacqueline collected the wood in her arms, she heard a distinctive snap of a twig. She froze and looked around, but saw nothing. She called out to Mark, whose reply confirmed he was still by the fire. Not seeing anything, Jacqueline continued to collect wood amongst the trees. She took the armful back to the fire and then headed back for some more. Returning to the same spot, Jacqueline bent down to pick up more wood when suddenly she was knocked to the ground. The force was so strong and unexpected that she didn't have time to react. She let out a yell as she crashed onto the floor. Her head hit the ground and the air was knocked from her lungs. Jacqueline gasped as a black bear pinned her down and savagely mauled her face. She could feel the deep tearing from the bear's claws on her body, the pressure from the bear's jaws as it bit down on her face. She screamed. In an instant, Mark was there. He whipped his Swiss Army knife from his pocket and jumped onto the bear just as it tried to drag Jacqueline off into the woods. Mark held on. He wrapped his arms around the bear's neck and with the small blade of the pocket knife stabbed the bear again and again, but the bear thrashed around, managing to throw Mark off its back, sending him crashing to the ground. The attack was so sudden and so powerful, it had taken the couple completely by surprise. The size and weight of the bear was incredible. It hardly flinched when Mark drove his knife into its flesh. The bear was so focused on Jacqueline that it seemed nothing would stop it. It continued its frenzied attack on Jacqueline, grabbing her in its jaws once more. Mark leapt up and threw himself at the bear again. He punched it on the muzzle and pushed the knife into the bear's neck over and over. The bear let go of Jacqueline and ran off into the woods. Mark watched as he saw the hind end of the bear lumbering over fallen tree branches and vanishing. Mark held Jacqueline in his arms. She was bleeding heavily. He tried to stem the bleeding, but she had so many wounds it felt hopeless. He picked her up and carried her to their kayak. Lying her down in the bottom of the plastic boat, he began paddling frantically across the water. All the while he was crying out for help. Jacqueline's cries died down. Her breathing became labored, and she closed her eyes. Mark told her not to give up. He yelled at her to stay awake. He desperately scanned the shoreline looking for anyone who could help. With each passing minute, he grew more and more desperate. Jacqueline was fading fast, but Mark continued to paddle the boat towards the next campsite in the hope of finding someone there. He, himself, had sustained significant injuries. The bear had severed several nerves in his arms and hands. He had puncture wounds from where it had bitten him as he fought with it, trying to save his wife. Blood oozed from deep gashes in his arms, trickling down his body as he pulled on each paddle stroke. After an agonizing hour had passed, Mark finally spotted two men in a paddle boat in the distance, a father and son from Pennsylvania. They heard Mark's desperate cries and paddled their boat over to the kayak. Holding the kayak steady against their boat, they carefully lifted Jacqueline onto theirs. Mark climbed aboard, and they all paddled together in search for help. They spotted a pontoon in the distance, with two people inside. Mark flagged them down. Remarkably, one was a doctor from North Carolina, and the other was an off-duty police officer. The doctor tried desperately to save Jacqueline. While the boat sped through the water, he stemmed the bleeding and began performing CPR, but it was too late. Help had arrived too late for Jacqueline. She succumbed to her injuries 2 hours after the attack, before they could get her to the park office 6 miles away. Mark was evacuated out of the wilderness and to Sudbury Regional Hospital. The deep lacerations he had sustained required surgery. He received 300 stitches and was pumped full of antibiotics to stave off infection. He slowly made a recovery in hospital. His injuries were fixed, but his heart was broken. His heroic efforts were rewarded with a Medal of Bravery, but Mark didn't feel brave. He felt like he could have done more. He wished he had known more about black bears and about their behavior. Bear experts who were asked to comment on the tragic events said that the bear wasn't just being aggressive, it was being predatory. It had sniffed out Jacqueline and Mark from a distance and homed in on their location. Seeing Jacqueline in the woodland on her own, the bear had stalked her. It had remained hidden and silent until the opportune moment when it struck. Mark had assumed when he was attacking the bear that punching it and stabbing it with the pocket knife would have been enough to cause it to run away. Instead, it continued to attack Jacqueline, causing fatal damage. Mark said that if he was able to hold on to the bear, grabbing it in a headlock and stabbing it with his knife, he should have slit its throat, killing it before it could inflict any more damage. Following the attack, officials immediately closed off the interior section of the park where the attack had taken place. They searched for campers in the area to warn, but because visitors were under no obligation to register their presence, it was not known how many visitors there were in the area. Black bear attacks were few and far between in the Ontario region. Since 1978, there had only been 4 known fatalities caused by black bears. The black bear involved in Jacqueline's attack was eventually hunted down by officials. They tracked down and killed a wounded black bear that was still in the area. It was a young, thin, and a hungry male who had been preying on the couple. It had taken the opportunity to secure an easy meal when Mark and Jacqueline visited the area. Black bears are especially dangerous when malnourished, sometimes causing them to attack people out of desperation for a meal. Jacqueline had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She hadn't startled the bear. She hadn't intruded on a female with her cubs. She had just been collecting wood for the fire whilst the male bear stalked her. There was nothing she could have done once the bear started to maul her. All she could do was wait for her unfortunate final affliction.
Alaska is one of the untouched wonders of the world, with miles of pristine glaciers and a truly amazing display of animal diversity. Due to this, Alaska holds more than half of America's national parks with an unlimited choice of terrain. One park in particular boasts the tallest peak in all of North America, Mount McKinley, aka Denali. Measuring over 20,000 feet, it is truly an impressive sight and attracts mountaineers from all over the world to Denali National Park and Preserve. Due to the protection that this area covers, the big 5 mammals are able to thrive here: Dall sheep, caribou, moose, wolves, and most infamously, the grizzly bear. From the beauty of the aurora borealis to the mystery of 700-million-year-old fossils, there is something for everyone to enjoy and learn about. But as a group of teenagers would soon find out, some lessons leave permanent scars. In 2011, 7 students from Staples High School in Connecticut were attending an outdoor education camp called the National Outdoor Leadership School, or NOLS for short. By this time, it was a well-established program that had been teaching students to develop their leadership and environmental awareness for the last 50 years. The boys were all of similar ages. Samuel Boas, Shane Garlock, and Noah Allaire were 16. Joshua Berg, Samuel Gottsegan, and Simeon Melman were 17. And the last boy, Victor Martin, was 18 years old. They were taking part in an extensive 30-day wilderness training expedition and had had the best 3 weeks of their lives so far. Together, they had learned and honed their survival skills over the last few weeks, and they were now putting these skills to use as they embarked on a solo trip into the Alaskan wilderness. They confidently trekked into the bushes, walking mostly in a single-file line as there was no actual path for the majority of the way, and they had to follow each other to ensure that no one would get lost. They were prepared for any situation, having been trained for first aid and extreme wilderness survival. The final task that they have been set was a solo mission to reach a specific viewpoint without the help of any adults and using only the skills they had learned in the last 3 weeks. They were excited to prove to everyone they had what it took to survive and headed off into the woods. That evening, they decided to cross a creek as Berg and Gottsiegen led the group to their goal. The bushes were becoming very thick and difficult to push through without facing injury, in addition to the risk of them becoming separated. As they stepped towards the creek, the older boys noticed some rustling on the other side and decided to wait it out to see what it was, as their training had taught them not to take any unnecessary risks. They felt their hearts stop as they saw what emerged from the bushes: a large brown bear and her cub. This was the worst-case scenario for any wilderness expedition, as the mother bear would be much more aggressive in order to defend her cub, killing anyone on sight. Unfortunately for them, they were immediately noticed. The mother charged at them, sprinting across the creek before the boys had a chance to react, although even if they could react, they were unarmed. She reached Gottsiegen first as he was heading the group and immediately knocked him to the ground. He tried to kick her away, but it was no use. Her size and ferocity outmatched him. She clamped her jaws onto his head and tried to crush his skull with her teeth. With blood running into his eyes and the force he felt being exerted onto his skull, he thought for sure that this is where he would die, in the mouth of a beast. Suddenly, she released his head. He thought she might run away, but he had no such luck. Instead, she latched onto his arms, biting and clawing at each one in turn, inflicting as much damage as possible. He screamed in pain as his muscles and skin were ripped from his body. Then, in hopes of finally killing the boy, she dragged her claws across his chest and punctured his lungs as he screamed out in agony. He could feel his ribs breaking under her weight and was blinded by the pain he felt. Next, she turned to the other leader, Joshua Berg. She swatted at him with her giant paws, the sharp claws ripping into his skin with each swipe. Her attack was short-lived, however, as she quickly turned her attention back to Gottsagen, who was screaming for the other boys to set off the emergency beacon to call for help. While Noah Allaire attempted to pull the alarm, the bear attacked him. She swatted him back and forth in her paws like a rag doll, blood flying from his body as her claws punctured his skin. Once again, she discarded the boy to move to another to attack, leaving Noah gasping for breath as he felt his lungs slowly deflate. She spotted Victor a little further away, who had been watching the carnage take place, his feet rooted in the ground in fear, unable to do anything but watch. She charged at him next, and his life flashed before his eyes. She grabbed his leg in her jaw and bit down hard, almost severing his entire limb. He screamed out in pain, and surprisingly, she immediately let go, rushing out into the forest and finally out of sight. The boys watched as she and her cub disappeared into the leaves and prayed she would not come back. They were already lucky enough to be alive, as they knew that she would definitely finish the job if she returned. Luckily for them, she had left the scene and would not return again. The entire ordeal had taken less than 5 minutes, but had left half the group fighting for their lives. The uninjured boys ran to the aid of their friends as the rain quickly began to pour and beat down on them, washing their blood into the creek. They activated their personal locator beacons to call out to anyone in the area to help them and attempted to set up camp around the dying boys to protect them from the rain. At 9:30 p.m., the Rescue Coordination Center called troopers to report the signal, and they were soon sent to rescue the teenagers at 3 a.m. While they were waiting, the boys tried to keep their friends conscious. Samuel Boas had graduated from the Westport Emergency Medical Services EMT program just a month previous and had already completed 100 hours of emergency medical training. He was able to use his skills under extreme pressure and with limited resources, saving their lives. They used plastic bags to close the wounds as best they could and bandaged it with gauze. They were all exhausted and traumatized and just trying to survive until help could arrive. Working together with the other boys, he was able to keep them alive until 3 a.m. when the emergency services were finally able to find their tent and fly them to safety. After assessing their damages, the team decided to separate them depending on their injuries, and as Joshua Berg and Samuel Gottsagen were without a doubt the worst injured of the group, they were immediately flown to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage and admitted into intensive care where doctors attempted to save their lives. The other boys were flown to Matsu Medical Center to treat their minor injuries and were released to their families soon after. A secondary crew was sent back to the area to retrieve the remaining teenagers from the area, even though they were not even aware of the attack or that there was a mother bear hunting in the area. They continued their search to find the bear, but they were ultimately unsuccessful, leaving the bear to roam and raise her cub as she had intended. Since the attack, the boys have come forward to explain their experience and warn others to be careful. There was ultimately nothing that they could have done to prevent the attack, and as it was all happening in a matter of minutes, quick thinking was not necessarily possible with such an intense time limit. They state that they will forever carry the physical and mental scars from that day and underwent intensive therapy to help them recover from their ordeal. The sounds of the broken bones and the screaming of their friends will never be unheard, but they are working towards their own recoveries. Luckily, Joshua Berg and Samuel Gottsagen were able to survive the attack without any permanent injury, but their recoveries were long and hard as they underwent multiple life-saving surgeries. NOLS have also spoken about the event, praising the boys for the survival skills and have stated that even if an adult leader was present, the outcome would likely have remained the same, meaning that the boys ultimately did everything that they could in the moment. They remain positive about their experience and are thankful to have narrowly escaped their terrifying final affliction.